Welcome to another edition of Off Air, the brand new TV show from Talk Radio on TV, because not only do we broadcast to your ears, we now broadcast to your eyes as well. And you can get this every single Monday. It's always me in conversation with somebody rather interesting. And today we have, I'm delighted to say, Ruth Lea, the economist and banker at the Arbuthnot Group. Ruth, a very, very good afternoon to you. Thank you very much for joining us. I have to say, I've held you in great esteem for a very long time because I've watched your performances on various things from Question Time to Sky TV to various other panels. And you've always been the sort of voice of reason in an age of madness. You know, when the Brexit arguments were going on, you were one of the few economists who actually were brave enough to stand up or sit down and say, everything's going to be fine.
That's right. Well, that's very kind of you to say so. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered to come. Let's be honest about this.
That's part of the contract.
I was going to say, as long as there's flattery all the way through, I can just about cope with that.
Well, we might find one or two things to disagree with, but I doubt it, because it really has been this very long journey for those of us who didn't think there was going to be a problem.
That's right.
To a place where, you know, we might have problems with the coronavirus, but I don't hear too many people saying we've got massive problems with the EU anymore.
Well, that's right. And it was very interesting because we sort of had a dry run on this sort of thinking over the Euro debate, because I was at the Institute of Directors at the time and I was very opposed to the Euro, and so was the IOD, because we thought the economies were not sufficiently converged to make sense to have a single currency. But my goodness me, did we have part of the establishment, large parts of the establishment against us, not least all the CBI. Oh, well, we you know, the Euro is such a wonderfully economic thing that we've got to join it. But when it came to actually Brexit, then it was, I remember looking at the Treasury document. This was prior to the referendum itself. I think it came out in May 2016, whatever it is, that even a vote, they said, would actually drive the economy into recession. This would be 500,000 extra unemployed. And this was the benign scenario, because they had another scenario as well. And I looked at this and thought, this is just incredible.
Yes. And these were the same people who told us if we didn't join the Euro, that would be disastrous. The same people who now say, at the most extreme end of it, but we haven't left yet. And that's why you haven't seen the effects.
The trouble is, this Project Fears is sort of, it metamorphoses, you know, it's an extraordinary creature that just keeps going. Although I was curious to see that the CBI has actually decided to be a little bit more positive about life, saying that actually we've just seen the US-UK negotiations sort of being, triggered off. Beginning. And the CBI did actually sort of partly welcome these, and I thought, hello, this is a change. Because I'm afraid to say the CBI has been consistently wrong on just about everything you can think about, from its bare-knuckle fight with the Thatcher government way back in the 1980s. The ERM, they thought that being kicked out of the ERM was going to be a terrific disaster. The Euro, of course, was terrific. Brexit, doom. You know, but
and I've always asked everybody who knows about the arguments on both sides and who's studied it properly, like yourself, what is it that the establishment loves about the European Union? I can't work out what it is. I don't understand why, for example, the CBI is so pro-EU. I don't understand why big business is so pro-EU, and all the people who are in politics pro-EU, and even the civil service, which we'll get onto in a slightly more rounded way, they're also pro-EU, and I just don't get it.
I think it is. Of course, with a lot of businesses, no doubt they have business connections with the European Union, so it makes sense for them to be in the customs union and the single market, etc., etc., etc. But I think that's very true, that the establishment has been overwhelmingly Europhile. And even when I was in the civil service, I did used to go to Brussels, and this was a long time ago, and the idea that one might have any scepticism about what was then the project was regarded as not quite nice.
Well, interesting about, you should talk about the civil service, because you were in it, but also we are now in the midst of a massive sort of, you know, civil service row with Sir Philip Ruttman, who decided to take it upon himself last Saturday to organise a press conference, organise for the BBC to turn up at the press conference, organise for himself to release an embargoed press release about his terrible, terrible treatment at the hands of Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, how he's going to launch himself at a court action. I mean, it's quite remarkable behaviour for a man who is a very well-fetted sort of Mandarin, getting paid £175,000 a year. He doesn't look much like a victim to me.
Well, I didn't think he looked like a victim, and I don't think he's done himself any favours at all, because, as far as I'm concerned, he justified just about any criticism that Priti Patel may have had about him. And we know that, I'm afraid to say, allegedly, that he is affectionately known as Sir Calamity, because he's had various disasters in the Department of Transport. And we know, too, that the Home Office has been not fit for purpose Service for a very long time.
Well, when people were looking for things that he'd done well, I think they came up with nothing.
That's
He's
right.
done plenty of things badly.
And I think, of course, the big one as far as Amber Rudd was concerned was the Windrush scandal. And again, I say allegedly because I don't know the actual details
Well,
of
I was
this.
talking to Stuart Jackson, former Tory MP, about this today, funnily enough, who said that basically during the whole Windrush scandal, for which she had to resign, he basically went on the missing list. Nobody knew where he was and he wasn't around. And so whereby he could have been a help to her, he clearly decided not to be.
Well, no doubt that was awfully convenient for him. But Amber Rudd was, of course, that she was the one, and I remember it very well. She was the one, of course, who took the fall.
Yeah, because she'd been badly advised. At the end of the day, it was her civil
advised.
servants who'd basically dropped her in it. And now you have to wonder whether or not the civil servants were doing something and acting in a way which was not entirely straightforward, shall we say.
It's very difficult to know without being there, but I do know Priti Patel, and I do respect Priti Patel, and we know that she's got a very, very big agenda. I mean, she's got the police, she's got crime, terrorism, you know, as well as the immigration system. We had the new immigration point system announced fairly recently. These are enormous subjects. You need a civil service that is absolutely at the top of its game and is prepared to cooperate with the ministers through and through. And that, again, without knowing exactly what's going on, that obviously has not happened, else you would not have had this bizarre, and I use the word bizarre advisedly, this bizarre announcement from Sir Philip the other day.
Well, it was terribly self-obsessed, it was terribly kind of arrogant, and it seemed to reek of a sort of entitlement that this guy seems to think that he should have, as if he was the guy who was supposed to be affecting change in her behaviour. You know, he even said as much that he was, you know, he urged her to behave differently, as if, you know, it's anything to do with him, how the Home Secretary operates. Now, when you were a civil servant, without wishing to be unkind, it was a while ago, right? I under the impression that in the days of Yes Minister in the 1970s, when comedy was actually quite funny, as opposed to just poking fun at you know, Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, it seemed as though the civil service was a much more sane place, if you like. It was not politicised. It was run by people who were perhaps conservative with a small c, and who kind of kept the ministers in check, because the ministers might be a bit too sort of garrulous or might get a bit carried away with something. I mean, is that a fair sort of description?
I think it is. I was actually in the civil service about 15, 16 years, in the 70s actually, and the 1980s. And I was started in the Treasury, and then I was in the Central Stats Office, which is now the ONS, and I had my final stint was the Department of Trade and Industry. So that gave you a very good insight, especially with the Treasury and the DTI, into two very major economic policy departments. And of course, in the 1970s, the United Kingdom was in a mess. We were the sick man of Europe, if you like. You know, this is the Ottoman Empire all over again. But it was interesting that we had Anthony Barber, he was a Chancellor, and then towards the end of the 70s, of course, it was Dennis Healey. And there had been various disasters, but I always got the impression that there was a good relationship between the senior civil servants. Of course, I wasn't one because I was relatively young in those days.
I was going to say, what was it like being a woman in that situation in those days?
The civil service was, even then, it was very equal gendered, so to speak, and some of the most dynamic people, civil servants, were women. I remember that very clearly. It was very, very different, I suspect, in the rest of business, but the civil service, I think, was at the forefront of equality in that respect.
And it was a job that was much sought after. I mean, I suppose it is now as well, but it was very much sought after then, because it was thought to be, you know, a safe job to have. You weren't ever going to get fired. You weren't ever going to lose seniority. If anything, you would just rise up through the ranks.
And there was the pension.
And there was the great pension and the conditions of work and all of that. And originally, of course, that was the reason public sector work was attractive. It might not have paid as much, but it was kind of safer, wasn't it?
But the remuneration, I suspect, by the time you allowed for the pension, was probably pretty comparable, quite honestly.
Well, this is why Sir Phil moaning and groaning on about, you know, 175,000 a year. God knows what his pension will be. It'll be pretty high, I would imagine, several million pounds. And for him to have the audacity, really, to have a go at the Home Secretary is incredible.
I totally agree with you. And I think actually being a civil servant in the 1980s was particularly interesting, and it, you know, compare and contrast with where we are now. In the Thatcher government was a revolutionary government, and the civil service at that time tended to be conservative with a small c. And of course, basically what Thatcher was doing, she was rewriting the rules of economic management. This was the end of the Neddies. This was the end of the sort of the mixed economy. This was privatisation. This was doing away with all the problems of the economy as they perceive them. Civil service, conservative small c, they did it.
Yeah.
And of course, you had some incredibly charismatic politicians at the time, like Norman Tebbit, like Nigel Lawson.
They were big beasts, weren't they?
They were big beasts, and they were respected, and the civil service respected them. Now, I mean, I have a great deal of time for Priti Patel. I have a great deal of time for Boris Johnson. They are having to push through a revolution for this country. We are leaving the European Union. Sorry, guys in the civil service, get real.
But you see, my belief is that if it was back in the 70s, we had done this thing, or say, for example, I mean, I suppose you would have, I don't know if you were part of it when you joined the European Union, or the EEC as it was then, but, you know, it seems to me that if the civil service had been tasked with leaving the EU, back then it would have been a much simpler and straightforward thing to do. Whereas I'm told that an awful lot of the reasons why the civil service has gone a bit sort of woke and lefty is because Tony Blair did that. Tony Blair made sure that he brought some of these people in to ensure that sort of in the long term, nothing much would change.
I suspect that is the case. I've heard those rumours again. I've not been in the civil service for years, so I can't actually prove to them. But I think you only have to see the way Sir Philip was behaving to realise that something had gone very badly wrong.
Yeah.
And then he was also Priti Patel. Oh, she was stamping her foot, or she was shouting and swearing. Oh,
making unreasonable demands. I'd like to know what those are supposed to be.
I just despair. No, he's made a fool of himself, in my opinion. And I don't know where we go from here. But the key thing is, as I've said already, Priti Patel has an enormous set of responsibilities on her plate. This government has an enormous set of responsibilities. They can't let civil servants stand in the way and say, well, I'm sorry, we can't do this. Wake up. Wake up. This country's got to change now. Do they realise this?
Well, this is part of the whole conversation about reform, isn't it? Because Boris Johnson won this huge majority. There were times, I think, towards the end of last year, before the election, that we were all kind of holding our heads in our hands going, you know, is there any way out of this? I remember going down to do a show on Westminster College Green that Saturday when Oliver Letwin made everybody sit on the Saturday.
God.
And then we got all the way through it and then nothing happened. And you just went, why have we all come to work on a Saturday and nothing's happened again? It's a nightmare. But now suddenly the logjam was broken when finally we actually did the business and left the European Union. The bill went through. It was then voted through in the European Parliament. I think it made a page 15 nib in the Times. And I suddenly thought to myself, what was all that about? You know, can we now move on to something else? And I think now Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings and the rest of them have got this kind of agenda for reform, which the public wants. And one of the things that I've been interested in watching is the reaction of the public to this whole Priti Patel thing, because they don't care about Sir Phil. They don't care what he does. They just want him out. And they want her to get on with reforming the police, getting more police on the streets, locking more people up, stopping the release of terrorists getting out early, and all of those things that they voted for.
Of course they did. And I think what was so interesting about the election itself, that this, we talk about the Red Wall. I actually come from the northwest of England, so I know that part of the world quite well. And there were an incredible number of seats that fell to the Tories. There were 12 actually in the northwest. Some of them were marginals, but some of them I think weren't so much marginal, like Lee and perhaps the Berry seats and Bolton seats. I was staggered when they went Conservative. But this were the British people saying, look, we voted to leave the European Union. Why haven't we left?
And this was the Labour Party who at the time, I remember during the political election campaign, were saying this is not about Brexit. Well, I was going, I'm afraid it is.
Excuse me.
I think it is.
This is about respecting the people's sovereignty. And I remember you must have been involved in this, but I was certainly involved in all this. That people start to talk about sovereignty. Oh, but Parliament is sovereign. I said, excuse me, Parliament's sovereignty derives from the people. And they say, oh, well, the Queen is sovereign. I said, yes, she has the titular sovereignty. But the truth is, in a democracy, it is the people. And the people voted to leave the European Union on the 23rd of June 2016. And they expect their elected representatives to actually respect their opinion.
Yes, exactly right. And when you think back again to those days of the likes of Dr. Philip Lee and Dominic Grieve and all of those Tories who were kind of, you know, bounced out of the party and then may or may not have come back in, they're all yesterday's men now. They've all disappeared. And nobody actually cares. I mean, even David Gauke, who still continually gives us the benefit of his great wisdom on Twitter, writing articles about it. I would say, I don't care what you think anymore. I didn't think you were a very good Justice Minister. I really didn't think you did the right thing over the black cab rapist by not having an actual judicial review, and you should have had one. And it was only thanks to Carrie Symonds, in fact, that it actually happened. And at the end of the day, you're a nobody. So stop spouting go and find something else to do, you know.
That's the trouble. I think it's time they moved on, to use a phrase. One or two of them, like Philip Hammond, may end up in the Lords.
Yes.
And delight us even further.
Yes, quite. And as far as the European Union construct goes, as we like to call it, you know, they're not in a very good place at the moment.
They're certainly not.
They've got a massive problem in Greece with all of these immigrants trying to get in illegally to the European Union, who are not even from the Syrian war scenario. They're actually all from Afghanistan and from Africa and from Pakistan as well. You've also got the kind of the German problem, where politically they seem to be all over the place. Angela Merkel is not going to survive. Macron is in a bad place. The Spanish economy, the Italian economy. I mean, this is before we even get started on coronavirus.
Well, exactly so. And I think it's interesting that I mentioned the euro earlier on as this is sort of a dry run for being anti-establishment, if you like, about where we were on Brexit. I'm sorry to say I was right on both of them.
Well, there's nothing wrong with being right, is what I always say. And in fact, it's nice to be proven right. And you've done it successfully for probably a lot longer than I have.
And I've reasonably battered. I mean, certainly not an establishment figure. You can't be an establishment figure and do what I've done.
No.
I'm not an establishment insider, and I think it's because I've got a completely independent mind that it works.
Well, and have you found that your sort of career has suffered in that sense because of that? Not. I mean, it obviously hasn't suffered in that you've had some fantastic jobs and you've had a very interesting career. But have you found that certain jobs have not been open to you, shall we say?
Well, I think the truth is that, of course, I was sacked from the Institute of Directors. This was back in 2003, and I suspect it was because I said some rather uncomfortable things, should I put it that way, about the Chancellor's policies. I said he was a spendthrift.
Yeah.
He didn't like that.
No.
And so, but enough's enough. I think that's enough. So there was that about it. And I think, too, that you get to the point where if you're thinking of, I don't know, jobs in quangos or whatever, they do wonder if you're a little bit too independent.
Yeah, I mean, you may not be surprised have suffered at the hands of some of that, in the sense that I've never been quite clubbable enough, as it were. I've always preferred to plough my own insider. Yeah, I've rather always preferred to sort of plough my own furrow. So I've always got reasonably high up inside organisations, and then it sort of stopped because they're never quite sure what I'm going to say.
So what made you such an independent-minded
I don't
person?
know. I think it was my father. My father was both my parents were from Scotland, very working class. My dad was an artist actually in newspapers, and to give it, my best way of describing what he was like was that when he was finally put in charge of the art department at the Evening News back in the day, when there was 2 evening newspapers in this country, and one of them wasn't run by George Osborne. And he was called before some management consultants who'd been brought in to try and change the working practices. And they said to him, we've had a look at your working rota for the week and the 4 or 5 people that you work with, and we can't understand it.
Right.
And he said, good. He said, well, tell me when you can understand it and I'll change it. And that was sort of his point. It was his view of the world. And he just really quite liked to bamboozle people and put them on their back foot.
You've just got to be a very independent person.
And I mean, he imbued me with the sense that I talk to everybody the same way, whether you're a chief economist or whether you're the guy making me tea or whether you're somebody, you know, selling me a ticket to a concert. You know, I treat everybody the same. And I don't kowtow to people, and I don't look up to people, I don't look down to people.
So we're not clubbable, are we?
We're not.
We're not insiders.
But we find ourselves in the same room, in the front of the cameras here, because I think those of us who didn't go along with the status quo have actually been proved right and have been proved to be much more perspicacious than anybody else.
Well, I think it is because you're not blinded by convention.
Yeah.
And you just think things through yourself. And I had a very interesting upbringing. I was a farmer's daughter, and my Victorian great-aunts were my idols.
Right.
They were so independent.
Right.
I mean, the idea that you would actually tell them to change their minds or they didn't think, forget it.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, when
You're
you
just
talk
independent.
to some people on the left side of politics, and they make out that there was this great movement which kind of empowered women. You know, it sounds like you've known some very powerful women your entire life, as I have. I mean, my mother was a very powerful woman. She worked as a teacher in the 1950s. They moved to London because he was a Protestant, she was a Catholic, which was a mixed marriage in Glasgow in those days. You know. And she always worked, and she was always independent. She always had her own money.
But there was prejudice against women.
Oh, very much so.
Until the Equal Pay Act of 1970, and then there's a Sex Discrimination Act, and of course I obviously supported those. And there was the idea, even back in the 1960s, that if you were going to be a professional person, a professional woman, it was perhaps a little bit questionable. But that's gone.
Yes.
It's utterly and totally gone.
Now it's kind of gone full circle, hasn't it? Because I think for women, I think it's still more difficult for women to be successful, because we look at the whole whole Priti Patel thing, and you see the way that she's described by people as kind of very ambitious and very kind of, feisty and very determined is a word you hear, all of which is true. But why would you necessarily say it in the sense that you wouldn't say that about, for example, I don't know, Matt Hancock?
Well, that
maybe because he's not very feisty.
That certainly struck me, that I thought Sir Philip was really quite personal. I did not like it.
No.
He's not made...
Well, he's called her a liar as well, which is quite strong.
He's not made any friends.
No.
And I'd be very curious to know whether he does go ahead and sue the government, actually.
Well, I mean, I hope he's got some good lawyers. He might need to spend quite a lot of money on them. But what do you make now of the whole kind of the setup of the way that everything is so polarised? Because we saw at the weekend, not only the lefties, as I call them, sort of having heart attacks about this guy coming out and having a go at Priti Patel and demanding that she be fired, only to be followed by Boris Johnson's announcement that he's having another baby, and some real vitriolic comments being made by people on the left, really personal, the sort of thing that nobody, I think, on the right would say about people on the left.
I think that's absolutely true. That has been my experience, that you get a lot of abuse actually for having the
Do you get
opinions
quite a bit of abuse as well?
Yes, well, I just block
even
it.
just for your economic policies.
Well, Euro, let's be honest, the Brexit thing. But let's be honest, on Twitter or something like that, if I don't like what I see, and some of it is quite abusive, I just block it.
Yeah.
I mean, and I've said this to other friends who get very hurt by what they say. I said, just block it.
Block it is the way to go.
You don't reply. Try not to read it, but just block it.
Yeah.
It's the only way to be, because I know that some people are desperately hurt by it. I mean, as we know.
Well, I think it's a very toxic atmosphere now, politics, and I'm afraid that social media contributes to it in a much bigger way than it really ought to. But I don't think some individual politicians really help either. But I was going to ask you, because you've worked with so many of those big beasts like Norman Tebbit and Dennis Healey and people like that, do you look at politicians now and see sort of slightly weaker and less interesting individuals and more the sort of what some people would say is a sort of professional political class?
I think with the politicians, of course, don't forget, when I knew Dennis Healey or Norman Tebbit, I was very much a junior civil servant. But I think now, when I look at Boris Johnson, I look at Michael Gove, these are incredibly capable politicians.
Yes.
And again, knowing people like Dominic Raab, Matt Hancock, and indeed Priti Patel, I think they're actually very, very, very high quality people, and they know what they want to do, and they are people of principle. And I think this is what really, when it really gets to me, when I'm talking to them, what I really get, the message I really get, they believe in what they're doing, and they also want to do what they think the great British electorate asks them to do.
And do you think that the loss of Sajid Javid is a bad loss, or do you think it's one of those things that it just sort of goes with the territory?
I think to some extent it just goes with the territory. I mean, when he resigned, I was a bit surprised about it, but I also understood Number 10 wanting the Treasury to be on side, because you know and I know that a lot of the problems in politics over the last 20 or even 30 years is because the Treasury, which of course tends to be the dominant department because it holds the purse strings, that the Treasury has actually set itself up in opposition to Number 10.
Right.
And we saw that with Theresa May and Philip Hammond. We saw it to some extent with, obviously, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, and of course we saw it with Nigel Lawson and Margaret Thatcher at the end of the 1980s, when actually Margaret Thatcher was right about the ERM and Alan Walters.
So you're not one of those that thinks it's better to have them as a sort of opposing forces trying to make sense of each other?
Well, I think it is if they get on. I mean, ironically, Cameron and Osborne, I think, actually worked very well together as a team.
I thought Osborne was a dreadful chancellor, though.
Well, whether they did or didn't, I think they were basically on the same page, and you didn't get the impression that there was actually a lot of conflict between the Treasury and Number 10. But again, I think Number 10's behaviour is justifiable, and to repeat, they have a huge agenda. And to have none of the Treasury chipping away in the background would not have been helpful. Right. And of course, the biggest part of the agenda is the negotiations with the European Union over the next, well, now 10 months. I mean, time is flying by, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's already March, and pretty soon we'll be in the summer.
They've started the negotiations today. The French seem to be coming up with some very unhelpful remarks. So is Mr. Barnier. Who knows where this is going to go? But again, talking about people who have great capability, when I saw Michael Gove speak last week, and of course he was making the announcement about the UK stance to the negotiations back last Thursday in the House, I thought he was very good. He said, look, we want to make progress by June on what we want to do. And if we don't make that progress, then let's just move on.
All bets are off, yeah.
Just move on.
And I think as time goes by, the public will follow the government along that line. They'll be more than happy because, once again, I used to say this to people who would moan and groan about the trade deficit here and, the trade plan there and tariffs. And I was like, look, one, why do we all need to be experts in international trade? Because we don't really need to be, one. And two, most people haven't got the capacity to learn something that you're supposed to be a specialist in the course of 2 months. So let them get on with it.
Yes.
And as you've said before, if I want to buy a German car, I'll buy a German car.
Well, exactly.
If it turns out that it's going to cost me 10% more, it will. I mean, I got a note from Scottish Power the other day saying, we regret to inform you that because the regulator has allowed us to increase our cap,
the cap came
it
off.
will be costing you an extra £4
Yes.
per year or
Cap
something like
came
that.
off.
And I'm like, well, £4 a year is not really going to
Yes.
make me richer or poorer. I think I can probably deal with it.
I mean, my central case is still that the EU will see sense and be pragmatic and realise that they have a 1995 billion goods trade surplus with us. That Germany has got a goods trade surplus with us of 30 billion. Think about that.
Yeah.
I mean, that is
It's a lot of money, isn't it?
a lot of money, and it's 1% of German GDP. And as you hinted earlier, there are problems in the European Union. All the economies, one way or another, have got difficulties. We hear a lot about our difficulties, but they've got difficulties too.
But our economy performs better than all of theirs, doesn't it?
It did last year. There's no doubt about it. And Germany in particular, because it's such an export-oriented economy, it relies on exports. And Chinese market slowing down. Never mind coronavirus, which is an unknown.
I'm hoping it's a sort of temporary blip.
Well, I am as well, but nobody seems to know, let's be honest about this. I suspect with the American economy, that's another big export market for Germany. Well, Mr. Trump is talking about putting on extra tariffs because he doesn't like the trade deficit.
Right.
And who's to blame him?
But that's another thing, isn't it? The attitude to Donald Trump is out of all proportion to what he's actually doing. His foreign policy seems to be working. He's pulling out of Afghanistan. He's completely neutered Iran, right? And his policy with North Korea seems to have worked. So what's not to like?
Well, I suspect he does say some things which are pretty unsavoury.
He does.
But I put those on one side. But he's the leader of the United States of America, which is our biggest ally, as no doubt we'll find out when the trade negotiations actually start.
Right.
But he is an ally, and along with the other the Anglophone countries like Australia, New Zealand and Canada, after all, we make up the Five Eyes, which is the intelligence sharing. I mean, surely that is a very, very interesting strategic bloc in the world. Isn't that more exciting than
Absolutely.
EU?
And if you take China into that equation as well, and you take India into that equation, and various other sort of, emerging economies possibly in South America, you've got an awful lot of business to do outside of the European Union.
Well,
this is why I've never understood why people were worried about it. But let me ask you this. Do you think the EU can survive in its current form?
The trouble is, it's very good at muddling through. And I remember when there was the great crisis over the euro back in 2010, 2012, actually it was Draghi that said he'd do everything he could to make sure. I remember giving evidence to some committee and I said, the truth is, they will just muddle through. And I know that there's always this talk about having extra reforms so that actually the euro in particular would look a little bit firmer, better foundations. I'll believe you when I see it.
It is very fragile, isn't it? All of that stuff. Let me move you away from the political scene for a moment and ask you about the BBC, because you've worked obviously on a lot of BBC shows. You'll know the BBC inside out. They're also an organisation in some peril at the moment because they obviously are in need of massive reform. They're trying to do it from the inside out. But I wonder whether, if we were sitting here a year from now, the BBC will be a completely different animal.
I just don't know, to be honest with you. I mean, my own experience of the BBC is that they're usually very fair to me.
Yeah.
It could be because I'm a woman.
Well, maybe they're frightened of you. There's always that possibility.
You're not, though.
I'm not frightened of anyone. But I mean, that doesn't mean that other people would not be scared of what you might have to say, because you're very smart and you might actually tell them something that they don't want to hear.
So they've been always extremely decent with me. But I mean, I've not been following the BBC in any great detail, to be honest with you. Although I think the technology will force change on them. And at some point, I'd be very surprised, perhaps not next year, but at some point the funding model will change for the BBC.
Yes.
But I think that's just the pressure, commercial pressure, quite honestly.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's a little bit like looking at the civil service, which I'm assuming, if Dominic Cummings gets his way, if Boris Johnson gets his way, will be reformed in some way, shape or form, which doesn't necessarily mean they close down departments and merge things, but they have to operate in a much more sensible way. And one of the things that's always staggered me about the banking system, for example, is that they don't in any way now communicate by email. And you just think, well, why wouldn't you do that? You know, not everybody has. They still communicate by fax if you want to give them some kind of an order. You know, I mean, they're much better now with apps and all that kind of thing. But the banking business has changed dramatically.
It has.
In the last 25, 30
Certainly.
years, you know, in terms of technology. And yet, ordinary individuals, if they wanted to just email somebody, can't do it.
I think back to the civil service, I think it's actually a change of mindset. These guys have got to realise what their job is.
Yeah.
And that's actually advising. And a lot of them are probably not so bad already, because I had some dealings with the DIT so when Liam Fox was the Secretary of State there. And I thought the civil servants I dealt with then were perfectly reasonable. But on the other hand, I knew civil servants that say, you know, in this department, they're nearly all Europhiles. And I'm sure they were. So come on, you know, the world's changing. They've got to realise who the boss is.
Yes, and I think that's, I suppose, what I was attempting to say about the BBC as well. That the BBC for a long time have had this kind of rather collegiate view of the world, whereby if you work for a particular programme or you're in the news department, and I know plenty of people that have worked there, you know, you are very much your own man. There is no such thing as a sort of corporate entity as such. And in some ways you can see that there's an advantage to that. But in other ways there clearly isn't, because as much as you want people to be independently minded, they actually don't end up being independently minded, because most people can't do that.
I think, again, it's the mindset of the BBC, which is metropolitan elite, lefty elite, quite honestly. And again, Europhile. But to be fair to them, they have to change.
Well, they're trying to. This is the funny thing.
And I think they are trying to change. And the other thing I suspect they have to change about is all about the climate change.
Oh, God. Well, climate change. Now, here's a subject we haven't touched upon yet, because I'm, again, one of those voices that does not suggest that there's no evidence whatsoever that there's a problem. But what I don't see is the point of this country leading the way, taxing people, telling people what sort of car they must drive, telling people precisely how much their carbon emissions must be. This kind of obsession with carbon neutrality drives me mad.
Well, I've written quite a bit about this, and I've been connected in it. I mean, I think what we're doing is virtue signalling.
Yeah.
You know, we want to
Totally.
we want to be the leader. This goes way back to the 1990s. Well, and then there's the Climate Change Act of 2008. But I always point out that, putting aside the science, insofar as perhaps climate change is connected with man-made carbon emissions, fine.
Possibly.
Let's just put that on one side. Let's not argue about it. But when it comes to global carbon emissions, we are 1%.
Yes.
1. China is knocking on for 30. Will China actually cut back on its carbon emissions because we decarbonise? No.
Of course not.
They are building coal-fired power stations. So is India. So is Japan, I think, now, because since the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And in fact, because I work for the Japanese, I've got a soft spot for the Japanese. But they're saying, oh, we'll cut back on our carbon emissions, but we are building coal-fired.
Well, it's like there are people now who genuinely walk around going, oh, it's okay, I've planted some trees. And you go, well, so? What difference does that make? I mean, my favourite story is about Chris Martin, the Coldplay singer, who decided to offset their last tour by putting 40,000 trees in a very hot part of southern India. Half of them burnt down, and the other half died because there wasn't enough water to keep them going. And you go, well, that's really not helping at all, is it?
Well, St Greta, as you know, was in Bristol.
She was in Bristol, yes.
Last week.
Causing havoc to anyone who was trying to do a job of delivering anything, of getting to a hospital, of any of that stuff.
Destroying College Green, by the way. I was at Bristol University for a year, so I know the place reasonably well. But one of her great statements was that something about this, it's very hot.
Yes, the world's on fire.
The world's on fire.
Yeah.
And I tweeted, not here, it's
not.
not.
It's really not. And also,
the
thing that really annoys me about her is, first of all, she's hailed as some kind of, incredibly wise and, insightful individual. Now, whatever she is, that is not what she is.
She's used.
She's being used by somebody to a very bad extent, and it's not. I don't think it's going to end well for her. But the other thing that I really object to is her constant refrain that nobody's listening, nobody's doing anything. Well, that's not true, is it?
Well, not here. I mean, because we are doing a lot, as far as I'm concerned, and it's pretty futile. I already said that. I think it's virtue signalling. It's futile gesture politics. We lead, the rest of the world follows.
I'm disappointed that Boris Johnson's bought into it, because he appears to have done that.
Yes, he does. Well, I wonder if it's, well, of course, we've got the COP meeting. I think this is in November. That's the
Glasgow,
conference of the parties for the United Nations.
They're talking about shutting down the whole city, by the way, because a friend of mine's got a couple of big businesses up there, and he's terrified of the fact that you won't be able to do anything in Glasgow for an entire week.
Quite unpleasant. I suspect it's going to be quite violent.
Yeah.
However, we've got COP, so perhaps Boris doesn't want to make too much of a fuss prior to that. Also, I mean, to be fair to him, although I hope he starts changing his mind, quite honestly, because I am somewhat disconcerted about what's happening on this, is that he's just do the EU, get through Brexit, let's get beyond the transition period, let's just deal with this one big issue, sort that and then move on. It could be that, I don't know, I simply don't know. But I do think, I can only repeat, our climate change policies are a joke.
They're bonkers.
Globally.
And they're also all over the place as well. I mean, you don't know why any number of things are suddenly happening. You don't suddenly, I mean, you look around London now, and the numbers of roads that have been completely just closed off to cars effectively, opened up to bikes only, all this nonsense about more virtue signalling about, well, you'll be healthier if you're on a bike. Well, you probably won't be. You might be killed if you're on a bike. You might be run over. You might actually find yourself breathing in worse fumes than anything anybody's ever seen. And the infrastructure of HS2 and all of that, it just seems to me to be all wrong.
Well, it's bizarre, and the truth is that we have cut back on our carbon emissions, as I say, when China's been increasing them exponentially. But we have cut them back. But this, to some extent, is the low-hanging fruit. This is getting rid of coal-fired power stations and having some renewables, but renewables are not that important, and switching over to gas-fired power stations, the less carbon emissions with them. But that's the low-hanging fruit. If we are to completely decarbonise by 2050, oh dear. And that's when it really will start hitting. People will have to get rid of their gas-fired cylinders, their heating at home.
Yes, well, that's what they've said, haven't they? They've said they want to rip out everybody's gas central heating.
By 2035, is it? There's no more diesel or petrol
possibly
engines.
2032.
Or hybrids.
Yeah, hybrids are out the window.
So, I mean, this is when I think people are going to say, stop.
Right.
And it's quite interesting that there was a survey today, actually, on Conservative Home, which suggests that of conservative activists, there's a fair proportion that are against the green policies, the climate change policies of the government. This is going, I think, once Brexit's sorted, hopefully, then I think that this is going to be the next big thing. It's got to be, because it impacts so much on people's lives.
It does. I think that's absolutely right. It's a very good point at which to finish. Ruth Lea, thank you very much indeed. We'll be back with more from Off Air next week.